You're listening to Pop, the History Makers, with me, Steve Blame. So Mark, welcome. Last time we saw each other, I think, was in 2020 at the World Peace Day in Berlin, and it seems...
2019 it was, actually.
Was it 2019? Yeah, it seems quite a while ago. I mean, a lot has happened between then. Obviously, COVID, and then Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine. And the world has changed quite significantly. And I want to come back to that later, because there is a feeling that a new Cold War is here or coming, or it's definitely, you know, we're on the doorstep of it, which may change not only our view of the world, but also it may change creativity and music, like the first Cold War had a very big impact. So I want to come to that a bit later, but we have a lot of similarities in terms of that we're both British originally. We both up and left and came to Germany. I presume we both got dual citizenship now.
Yes.
And quite happy about it. And we also had that experience of moving and going to another country, which I believe has a great impact on your psyche and changes you to a certain extent. But I want to start with not particularly like just looking back at your childhood, but I know, and I've seen in other shows that you've got pictures of you when you were very young in Manchester. And I just wondered what goes through your head when you look at a picture of you at a very young age in a different society to where you are now, as a different person in a lot of ways to who you are now. So what do you see when you see a picture of you when you were young?
Well, I usually can remember quite a bit about when the situation that the photograph was taken, or you know, I mean, as a small child, like a sort of 7-year-old or whatever, I was on telly for there's a program which for Granada Television, which was made about our school, St. Mary's in Horton Green, and the kid who's speaking on this program, it's not me, you know what I mean? It's like, who's this kid? You know, it's quite weird. But most of the time, you know, I'm not so nostalgic really, so I don't kind of like dwell on the situation. But yeah, back then, I think I had a very different vision of what the future was going to be. As a very small child, you know, I thought we were going to be like in the Jetsons, flying, like riding around in flying cars and stuff like that, and have robots serving us. But as I got older, I realized that wasn't the future, and I just wanted to see what the rest of the world had to offer, really, or the rest of Europe at least, you know. And so coming to Germany was one thing which was just out of curiosity more than anything else. And when I look at the two sort of me's, you know, it's like it was the me that could have gone on to. I could have been just a graphic designer working in an agency, slogging my guts out for nothing, you know, and all these horrible people around me kind of like backbiting each other. That was what the advertising world seemed to be like for me. And I was kind of like, I didn't want to work in a factory, to be honest, you know. I didn't want to work in a steelworks or something like this. Or in where I grew up, we had like clothing manufacturers and hat producers and stuff like this, and you know, so textiles industry, and I wasn't interested in going into that either. And so that could have been my future, you know, that could have very well been my future, but I decided to try something else instead and see what else was on offer.
When I look back at certain aspects of my life during I think I'm 1 year younger than you, so we're effectively the same age. So we grew up in the same era. And when I look back at a period of great unhappiness and feeling very distant to everything that was around me. And every bit of music that I liked at that period was about going into another world, like leaving this world and going into another, like liking Bowie as this sort of alien from another world, and me wanting to leave where I was from to go somewhere else, wherever that would have been. And I just wondered whether you, because a lot was happening in your life in Manchester before you actually left for Germany, you know, the second time, as it were. But a lot was happening in your life. And for me, it was more about escaping my old life. So whenever I sort of look at your story, I look at it and think, you had a lot of opportunities in Manchester, but you left those opportunities. And I wonder whether it was a feeling of disconnect and you just wanted to get away and discover yourself.
I didn't know this at the time. You know, I didn't know that that was a possibility at the time, to discover myself, because I didn't think about that. You know, growing up in miserable Manchester during the 70s was really kind of very trying, you know, and being, as a kid, you know, at school, being bullied and stuff like that was one of these things which kind of like really maybe you just want to escape and get away and go somewhere else where I didn't have to deal with that kind of situation. Working in Virgin Records in Manchester opened up completely different opportunities, really, because I got to see loads of gigs for free and I got loads of records for free and things like that. And I was able to manipulate people's tastes in music by the records that I chose to play them and stuff. But even that was not, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough excitement. It wasn't enough of a challenge. You know, it was just an everyday ongoing thing. And as you know, the music scene was kind of developing into this punk rock thing in the mid 70s. You know, it's exciting and thrilling and stuff. But by 1978, I thought, you know, I'd had enough. Really, it had become, you know, I thought that the punk idea had kind of washed itself out and become sample and Paul Noir. And I was like, I didn't really like that. I thought that was kind of like selling itself a little bit too cheaply and a bit too quickly. And so I thought I'll go and have a chance and look around elsewhere, really, you know.
I mean, there was a nihilism to the 70s, obviously, in Britain. The nihilism was a lot to do with the society in terms of that growing up in that era. You did feel that you didn't really have much of a future because it was massive unemployment. There was a lot of social unrest and so on and so forth. And yet you go to a city, eventually you go to Berlin, which is a city almost exists in a sort of nihilistic sphere as a sort of island within East Germany, an island of West Germany within East Germany at that time. When you got to Berlin, how did you initially feel? Was there a fear of being in this new place, or was it an instant excitement?
Oh, it was instant excitement. It wasn't. It was not. I didn't have any fear about Germany because I'd had the opportunity to go to Germany in 1976 and for the first time, and I realized like this myth that we'd been told at school and that my parents believed, you know, from my entire school life, was that the Germans were all evil. You know, and that, you know, Germany was not the place where you need to go. You know, to go there and find out that this was completely untrue just threw everything out of the window, really. It made me question a reality that I'd believed in the UK. And suddenly, you know, I saw the reality that it wasn't true. So going to Berlin was all about excitement, really. It was not about, you know, fear. Not even, you know, where it was in the middle of East Germany was kind of like scary, you know, having to go through East Germany to get to Berlin was quite scary in its sense, but it was also thrilling as well. It had this kind of like allure to it, which I was this adrenaline feeling that you get from this kind of situation just really made me addicted to it, really. Yeah.
I didn't mean fear in terms of Germans. I meant fear in terms of the Cold War. But I mean, my father had a German guy that worked for him. So we had a friend in the family who was German. And I think I was lucky in that way. So my perspective in that era, and I know what you're saying, because generally in British society, particularly of that era, it was incredibly isolationist and also very held over from the Second World War. But this island that Berlin was an island that sort of became very special, because if you wanted to get out of the Bundeswehr, the German army, you just had to register that you lived in Berlin and you went and lived in Berlin as a young German. So it meant it attracted lots of young people, and the type of young people that went were anti-war, anti-army, probably also a lot of anti-authoritarian people. So you went into this sort of bubble of society which had this energy to it. Were you aware of that energy when you first got there, and how did you perceive it in terms of where you came from? What were the differences?
Well, I had absolutely not really much of an idea of what Berlin was going to be like at all. You know, I mean, I'd seen it on portrayed in movies like, you know, the spy came from the cold, or, you know, Funeral in Berlin or something like that. But I had no real kind of idea what it actually looked like or what it meant. You know, Bowie had kind of made, you know, Lone Heroes here. That was all I really knew. So to arrive in Berlin and then discover that it was there was a totally different kind of normality here. Now, the next day when I arrived, I went to get some change for the phone to call my mum, and I went to this bar on the end of the street, and it was the person behind the bar was a transvestite, you know, bright orange hair and a polka dot top. Yes, darling, what do you want? You know, I was like, wow, this is normality. It was completely not. And I realized at that moment, you know, the Berlin of kind of like this cabaret image of Berlin was real in a different way. You know, it was like everybody was accepted and acceptable, and it didn't matter where you came from, because look, most of the people here were all washed ups from West Germany, like you said. You know, they were all draft dodgers and, you know, gay men and pacifists and Atomkraft 9 Danke types, you know, and anyone who just didn't want to go and serve in the military were here, surrounded by the military, protected by the military. And that was kind of like this strange ambiguity. I was like really fascinated by it. Yeah. And the fact that people just kind of accepted you regardless of where you came from or what your background was. I thought that was very refreshing, you know.
Were you not concerned that you'd left something behind, to the extent, you know, you were in the Frantic Elevators, which was with the early band with Mick Hucknall. You had contact to Tony Wilson, which I know sort of helped you out in terms of your initial being in Berlin. Ian Curtis. So your connections were incredibly strong, probably in terms of the future rather in terms of that time, at that moment in time. But yeah. When were you aware that you'd actually left something behind, and did that have an impact on you at all?
Well, I never got that feeling, to be honest. I never thought I'd left something behind, because, you know, Rob Gretton was really enthusiastic when I said I was going to Germany, because I think he obviously thought, oh, here's somebody going to be actually in the country. He'll be able to maybe help us get a gig, something like that. So, and Ian was fascinated by the idea that I was going to Berlin as well. So it was, I didn't feel I was being discouraged. Only Mick was a bit discouraging. You know, he was a bit upset that I was leaving the band to go to you know, enemy territory, so to speak. But everybody kind of accepted it, because they realized that I wasn't happy in Manchester, and it wasn't. And I didn't see a future for myself, because, you know, the people from Virgin Records that was working in the small Virgin Records shop in Manchester, they came to me and said, yes, we're going to be opening up this brand new mega store. I was like, what's a mega store? I mean, well, it's like a supermarket for records. And I just had this idea, you know, this vision of like me, you know, people walking around with shopping trolleys, you know, putting Fleetwood Mac and Eagles records in it. And I was like, I don't want to work in a supermarket. I might as well work in Tesco's. I don't want to do that. And so to actually leave and uproot was something quite kind of easy, really, in a sense. I didn't feel like I was leaving anything behind. And when I got here, and then eventually, when I got here, there wasn't any kind of scene, so to speak. You know, it wasn't really kind of like punk rock central in Berlin. You know, there was one small place called Punk House near Adenauerplatz that had like it was like a punk cafe kind of thing. But other than that, there was nothing much really going on here. It was still kind of like everyone was still into Deep Purple and Pink Floyd, and it was like, okay, you know, it's a different scene, a different feeling. But by 1980. Everything had changed. It had developed its own kind of new wave scene, which was completely different to the scene that I'd experienced in Manchester. You know, like being in Manchester, people they formed bands so they could escape from the misery of Manchester. Like hopefully somebody might discover them, and with their dole money they bought guitars and thrashed out kind of like politically themed songs and stuff about living in life in the UK at that period in time. But in Berlin, everybody had already escaped, so there was no real reason for them to kind of do that. So they just invented it themselves. They invented their own version of what they thought was a new wave, really. And I thought that was really exciting. It was much more thrilling and different than this desire to become a pop star, which was, I thought, everybody wanted to be in the UK. Everyone wanted to be on top of the pops,
Yeah, it was also, I mean, what I feel of that era in Berlin, it was almost a reflection of the punk era in Britain, where it was more easy to just make music with your friends and do what you wanted to do without any feeling you were trying to be successful, or you were trying to actually create something for a career or something like that. It was just about having fun and developing stuff.
Yeah, being arty, like, because it was very artistic, everything. It wasn't like the music wasn't geared towards being a pop song and being on the radio or anything like that. The music was made as a form of expression, as an art form. And when you look at bands like, Die Toten Hosen or Einstürzen und Neubauten and Malaria, three kind of like mainstays of that era, their music has stood the test of time because it doesn't kind of fall into any conformity of such, it's new and different, but it's still new and different.
I mean, these are all people that you were very closely involved in. I'll come to that in a second, but I just want to get a feeling of this, whether there was some form of nihilistic attitude in Berlin at that time, and whether that was a reflection of, the 80s, the early 80s were the height of the Cold War. And whether this nihilistic attitude, if it existed, was a reflection of that, because it was really, and Berlin has always been sort of party till you drop type idea. It's, there's never been a limit on what you can do in Berlin.
Well, the thing that was the key actually to the city, and still is the key to the city, is the fact that Berlin is open 24 hours a day, and that you could drink from dusk till dawn every day, and being open 24 hours a day just opened itself to being able to party all day and all night and all day and all night until you dropped. And the feeling of this city which was east and west. It was capitalism versus communism in one place. It was, Eastern army versus Western armies, like in one place. People never talked about, really, the normal everyday person on the street never really talked about, the Third World War, that it would happen in Berlin. But in films and in books, it was always portrayed as being the place where a Third World War would kick off between the forces of East and West on the border of East Berlin and West Berlin. I never felt like that once I got here. I felt very, very safe here. Although my German friends, they from West Germany, they all thought it was going to end here. This was the place where it was all going to kick off and we'd all die, and it could all happen tomorrow. So sod it, let's do what we want. Let's just do everything we want to do and do it now, because like next week it might all be over. And that was the attitude that everybody took. And I just went with that because it sounded quite interesting. It sounded, yeah, right, well, of course we could all die tomorrow. So yeah.
How connected were West Germans in Berlin to East Germans in Berlin? Because even in an earlier period, you could go and visit, couldn't you? You could go over and take a look, and you did many times. Yes,
I did. Yeah, my friends here, my West German friends, who had all kind of washed up in Berlin, almost hardly any of them went to East Berlin. Germans only went to East Berlin if they had relatives, usually, or if they had to go to, say, a concentration camp with the school or something like that. Then they'd go to East Berlin. But generally, they only ever went once in their life as school kids, usually, and hated it, and then came back and had nothing positive to say about East Berlin. Whereas I you know, having no family members in East Germany, you know, looked at it with different eyes. And so I went over there with a completely different viewpoint of what East Germany and what East Germans were like. And I found it quite fascinating because it's like you know, you just meet someone in a cafe and just start chatting to them, and they're fascinated because you're from England, and it's like they're never ever going to meet someone from England just by chance. You know, they see soldiers walking around shopping, but they're not going to speak to them because they're not allowed to speak to them. But to sit in a cafe and speak to someone, have this opportunity to find out what's it like, what's the West really like, you know, that was quite thrilling for me. It was like interesting because these people had no information. It wasn't like today where you've got the internet. You know, they had no information. They could only watch what was happening on West German television, and that was the only insight into the West. And you know, they had dreams and desires. You know, everyone you met always wanted, I'd love to go to Paris and see Paris. I'd love to go to Italy and see Rome. You know, I'd love to go to London. You know, they had these dreams, but they knew that these dreams were never ever going to be fulfilled. And
what were their ideas of your life? What were their ideas of what sort of life you must have come from?
Oh, they all thought I lived in a mansion. They all thought I lived in a mansion and had a Rolls Royce. You know what I mean? It was like they all thought I lived in a luxury apartment, and everything was fantastic, and I had, you know, like everything that I wanted and desired, and I could travel wherever I liked. And I tried to explain to them, look, you can only travel to places if you've got bloody money. You know, so I tried to explain to them my flat was a 22 square meter hovel in the back half of a house with an outside toilet and no shower. You know, they had no idea about, you know, that they didn't believe me. They didn't believe me at all. You know, they thought I lived in a mansion.
Was the first time you went to East Berlin to the May Day official parade, or did that come later? Was that?
Oh, that was later. That was much later. The May Day parade was much later. That was 82. I was, you know, I'd arrived in 1978, and like after being here for 3 days, I went to East Berlin. It was like I was trying to find out how to get to East Berlin. No one knew how to go to East Berlin because they'd never been there. So they kept telling me, "Oh, you can't go, you can't go." And then by chance, I just I went to Checkpoint Charlie and went and discovered I could just walk over, and I went, and it was fascinating. It was like science fiction come real. You know, it's like being beamed down into another planet that resembled our planet, but which was totally different, with, you know, loads of soldiers everywhere. And it was like going back to the 50s in a strange, weird way. You know, it's like 50s world in a certain aspect. You know, like everyone was in uniform, every single person, you know, the shopkeepers, the soldiers, everybody, bus drivers, everybody. And yeah, it was just a fascinating kind of insight into this kind of Easty world. And it didn't feel threatening in any way. I felt quite relaxed there. You know, there was no advertising, there were hardly any cars, and the people kind of looked similar. You know, like I'd imagined everyone to look grey and miserable, but they looked kind of happy. And I went to Alexanderplatz. It was a beautiful sunny day, and it was like, you know, fountains and kids playing and grannies, you know, sitting in the park and stuff. And it was just very peaceful. And I thought, I like it here. It's quite nice. I wouldn't want to live there, you know, but I thought I'd go there and check it out a bit more. And I found out that this place where I went to have my dinner in, which was like school dinners. Yeah, it was like these dinner ladies ladling out slops for these people, you know, for the lunch. That I discovered that in the evening, that's a discotheque. So I waited until the evening till around about 8 o'clock, and then I went back to Alexanderplatz under the TV tower. I went to this discotheque, SB Disco, which was just really provisional. It was like some, you know, bloke with 2 cassette players, you know, playing music, and car headlamps as the lights. You know, it was very, very simple. But you know, it was like an insight into this kind of like East German life. And so I went there like really a lot. Yeah.
How did you actually move into being involved in the music scene and making music in Berlin?
Well, it was never an intention to actually be in a band. After being in the Frantic Elevators, I thought I don't want to do it anymore, really. And just coming here, you know, Mick and Rob Gretton, they're both like, oh yeah, now you're there, maybe you can get some gigs in Berlin. You're obviously going to be going out, you know. So it was just that connection. It was like, you know, possibly there's an opportunity maybe, but you know, Robert Senders, when they started Factory, they started sending me Factory records. It's already sent me the Ideal for Living 12-inch that he'd had repressed. You know, like, can you send that to the radio stations and maybe we'll get some coverage of some kind. No one was interested at all. You know, no one was interested in this miserable band from Manchester. And so it just like floundered really, and going out. I think a lot of people thought, because I worked for Factory, in their eyes they had this vision of me kind of working for this fantastic record company. They had no idea the chaos behind this record company. They obviously thought that maybe I was their stepping stone to getting a record deal or whatever. So I was embraced and accepted everywhere, in all the bars and all the clubs and everything. I got for free, and I never paid for a drink ever, and it was kind of, you know, quite nice. I wasn't going to complain to that. And then being drunk one night, you know, like there was the last night of excess. It was this club in Schöneberg, near the Bahnhof Zoo, and it was like this. It was their last night. It was kind of like 3 nights of the club, and one of the promoter came to me and said, "Oh, I know you've got a guitar. You know, like a band's they've decided they can't play, so could you go home, get your guitar and fill in?" And being very drunk and drugged at the time, I just kind of, yeah, of course, and went home and got my guitar and did this impromptu set with Adrian Wright from the Human League and another friend from America, and it was pretty dreadful. And I thought, I'll never do that again. And then I went to this L36 a couple of months later, and it was saying, "Oh, can you fill in for this band that are not going to play?" And I was like, "Okay." And it was with Christoph Hahn, who plays was the guitarist of the Swans. And it's like, "Yes, we'll form a band." So we formed this band, did this one gig. Never again. We'll never do that ever again. And then, "Oh, can you do it? Can you do it on the 17th of June?" And I was like, "I don't have a band." And I agreed, because I was drunk and drugged at the time, you know. So I agreed foolishly, and then I realized the next day, "Oh, what have I done?" And so I asked another expat friend who'd been washed up here, this guy called Alistair, who I knew. I said, "Yeah, Alistair, can you sing?" And he's like, "Strangers in the night." I went, "Oh, brilliant, we've got a gig next Wednesday. Come round to our house and I'll show you how to play guitar." And so he came round to my flat, and we wrote a couple of songs in my room, you know, for this gig. And then we did this gig, and we thought, we'll never ever do that ever again. It was a complete disaster, right? A total nightmare. We'd been waiting for a sound check all afternoon in Franken, in the pub across from SL36, yeah. And we got completely plastered by this point. We got on the stage, and all our guitars had gone out of tune in the meantime, and we thought, we're never going to do that again. And the minute we got off stage, this girl who we knew, Elizabeth, who had a record label called Monogam, she released like P1 and Neubauten and stuff. She comes running up, she goes, "Oh, that was brilliant. I want to make a record with you." And it kind of just spiraled out of control from that point on.
I mean, Berlin was a sort of, I don't know whether this is a really positive way of saying it, but it feels like the music scene was almost like a swinging scene, you know, like everyone in every band played with everyone in everyone else's band.
It was almost like that. Yeah, it was like, well, there weren't that many people in this scene. I mean, it wasn't like there were like thousands and thousands of people involved. It was like the scene was literally a handful of people. And it's like whoever you got pissed with the night before, kind of, he ended up being in their band for a gig, you know, and that kept it kind of vibrant and ever developing, you know. Everybody, like literally everybody, played at least once in somebody else's band almost, or worked with them in some capacity, you know. Like I did the sound for Neubauten for a couple of gigs, like Documenta and stuff, and you know, I was the sound engineer for Malaria, and you know, and all these different things that just kind of just all happened together because we were just a very, very small scene. That's really the reason why.
So how important was that period of your life in terms of developing the skills that you're able to use today?
Well, I think, you know, like I've kind of done virtually every job there possibly is in the music business up at that point, you know. Like I'd worked in a record shop, I'd been in a band, you know. I've become the sound engineer and the manager, and you know, I've done all these different things, and I got an insight into how the business on that side, on each side of these like sections, how they all worked, and I kind of like thought, I don't want it to be like that. I don't want it to be like that, you know, and I never kind of had any aspirations to be a pop star or anything like that. That was like, you know, my mates were all pop stars, you know, they'd all attained kind of like notoriety, you know, we'd been on top of the pops and stuff like that, and that's fine. I'm happy with that, you know, that they managed, they became successful. I was really proud of my friends that they'd attained, that, you know, they'd stuck with it and become, you know, stars. But that wasn't really the thing that I was chasing. You know, I didn't want, that wasn't really important for me. I didn't make music really to become famous. You know, I made music because I enjoyed making music. I like to be creative. All these kind of sections really kind of just like led me to a point whereby, you know, like I've been inspired by people like Daniel Miller and by Tony Wilson, and their approach towards like running a record label and signing bands and the kind of band that they wanted to have on the label and stuff like that. I've been really inspired by that. I've been inspired by Malcolm Garrett and Peter Saville and the design of the artwork of record covers and things. So you know, having known these people, I kind of brought that to myself here in Berlin and kind of used the same kind of attitude and the same kind of like vision or whatever at the point when I actually come to forming my own record label in 1990, and then it was then I took on a different role within this music business. I became the record label owner stroke manager, which I actually didn't like the idea of, because I thought, you know, the people who kind of run these record labels usually completely self-centered narcissists or whatever, and I didn't really want to have that sort of image really. So I tried to run my label in a more kind of sort of a mixture of Tony Wilson and Daniel Miller really.
Just want to go back a bit again, because obviously we're going to come to you know, this era a little bit later. But you mentioned the fact that you were a bridge to a certain extent, but you were a bridge in a sense both ways, weren't you? You were a bridge of the culture between Britain and Germany, not just for factory artists in Berlin, but and you became a bridge for German artists in essence to Britain. And I think this was particularly highlighted when you eventually did that piece for the Tube, when you worked for Malcolm Geary. How did they approach you, and why did they come to you? What was that particular reason?
It's all Chris Bond's fault. Chris Bond, who was Bieber Kopf, who wrote for the NME, they asked him, you know, because he'd written about like Neubauten and these kind of like the Berlin Krankheit music scene, you know, he'd written about this in the NME, and so they asked him, you know, if he would do this program, the Tube, and he politely declined and suggested that they contact me because I'm the Brit living in Berlin. And so that's exactly what they did. They contacted me and asked me if I would be willing to help them put a program together for the Tube. Now, it really meant, would you do this program for us? Because I ended up doing everything for them, preparing everything, getting all the equipment, getting all the permission, which was a nightmare. You know, getting the permission from the US forces, from British forces, to be able to film in their sectors. You couldn't just go on the street with a camera and film willy-nilly. You couldn't just do an interview on the street willy-nilly. You had to get permission to be able to stand on the street and do an interview, no matter what. So I got all this permission, and I got the equipment and everything. And then they came to Berlin and we did this program. But at the same time, I'm saying to them, if we do this program, we can't just do West Berlin, because Berlin is not just West Berlin. Berlin is also East Berlin as well. And they were like, well, how are we going to do that? You know, it was just that no one had ever done anything like it. No one had even attempted to do anything like it. And so they were completely like, do you think you can pull this off? You know, and well, so I'll go, I'll find out, you know, I'll find a band. They wanted a punk band. I'm like, so I tried to explain to them, well, punk doesn't officially exist in the GDR. So if you're a punk in the GDR, you go to prison, basically. So they're not going to, fall head over heels to get a punk band on British television, because that doesn't represent what East Germany is trying to represent. They want to have, nice, clean cut kids, showing how nice East Germany is. So I said, we'll have to try and find something else. And I, by chance, found this band walking down the street, literally. They were called Jessica, and they didn't have any permission at all to even own instruments, let alone play in front of an audience. But they looked the part, and their music was kind of like the Police, and so it was like safe, And so I managed to talk the authorities into putting this unknown band, who were not registered with them, onto British television. And at that point, these Germans kind of, they were only interested in getting the Western currency off us, really. They cost a fortune. Cost Granada, Time Tees Television, cost them a fortune to put this program in East Berlin together. Probably double what West Berlin cost. But we come to this point where the East Germans suddenly realized, like a week before we're about to air the program, that they had to put Jessica on the telly in East Germany first, so they could say that they had discovered them, because they couldn't let us as Brits put this East German band on TV and say we discovered them. But in reality, that's what happened. I discovered this band and put them on, and it was like it changed their lives in East Germany. It also changed the way the East Germans thought. The authorities thought, I think, and it was a bit of a thaw into the Cold War at that moment. Like we thought we'd be able to bring East and West together through music, and that was something which I thought was really, really important. The fact that we'd done this, we'd managed to pull it off. That I thought that was really important.
Yeah. I mean, as a viewer back then, I remember seeing that, and I was absolutely enthralled and fascinated, because it was this thing that you never knew and you'd never seen before. So I think that was a phenomenal thing. I mean, one thing that in essence, in a very minor way, connects us. I used to get audiences for the Tube from Malcolm Geary. Used to ask me to go to nightclubs and get the most fashionable people, organize a bus and drive up there for 5 hours from London. It was hell, so they could be in the audience to make it look a bit cooler. That was the idea. Anyhow, that was my connection to the Tube, not as fundamentally interesting and fascinating and groundbreaking as yours, for sure. In that period, was it before that period that you organized that gig for the Die Toten Hosen in the church in East Berlin?
It was just a couple of months before, yeah. I'd like that was it. And the Toten Hosen concert, the first one, was in March of '83. Now, I played a secret gig in just outside of Prague in 1982, and so I realized it's possible to, go against the communist kind of like restrictions of bands coming over and playing. It was very difficult to actually organize, but because you had to get guitars and basses and drums and things. But because people don't really realize that it was really difficult to buy these instruments. You couldn't just go into a music shop and buy yourself a drum kit or a guitar and an amplifier and start thrashing out songs, because these things were unavailable in East Germany. You could buy an acoustic guitar, you could sit in front of a campfire and sing, Bob Dylan, but you couldn't go into a shop and buy an electric guitar and impersonate the Velvet Underground. It was like these things weren't available. To own these things, you had to have a shine, a piece of paper which was state approval that you could play, and you're proficient enough to own an electric guitar. And then what were your lyrics about? There were all these controls and all these things, that the kind of restrictions that stopped you from being a musician. Really, they put as many obstacles in place as possible. And it was only the ones that kind of stuck at it and went to university and studied music, and that you could actually read music and you're proficiently at playing and stuff like that. These were the ones who got the record contracts in the end. Like a punk band playing in the cellar, they're not going to get permission from the state, And so And it was the same throughout the whole of the communist bloc. It wasn't just, reserved for East Germany. So when I went to do this illegal concert in Prague, I realized we got around these obstacles, and my idea was to play with my band, Die Unbekannten, in East Berlin, but we had tapes and synthesizers and drum machines, and no one in East Berlin had a drum machine or a synthesizer, none of my friends, certainly not, and so it was like, well, we have to change, we'll have to think of something else. And as I was on tour with the Toten Hosen, I just put it to them. I said, well, I've been smuggling your cassettes into East Berlin for the past year, so maybe you could do it. We're going to be in Berlin. We can go take you over to East Berlin. We'll do a gig. And would you be into that? And they were like, yeah. They never gave it a moment's thought, really, like how difficult it would be. And then I said to my two friends I had in East Berlin, I asked them, would you be interested in doing this? Because I'd discovered meanwhile that in East Germany, in East Berlin, they had these things in the church called a blues mass, which was basically, some guy with an electric guitar playing Bob Dylan songs, And I was like, oh, maybe I could play with my band. But then it became the Toten Hosen. And I said to these girls, if we can do this gig, ask the priest if we can do the gig here. But if we do it, we get caught. I'll get kicked out of East Berlin, or I'll get kicked out of East Germany, and I'll never be able to come to East Berlin again. But for you, your lives will change forever. You'll be put in prison, and with no idea what could happen to you. You have to think about it, whether you really want to do this or not. And they waited for like 5 seconds and went, yeah, we want to do it. And at the time I was, okay, are you sure? Because I knew how dangerous it was for them, and it was sort of difficult, organizing something totally secret. You can only invite 30 people. I said, like, only 30 people. Don't invite anymore. I wanted it to be 30 because I wanted it to be like the Sex Pistols gig in Manchester. I wanted to have it, hoped it would have that kind of impact. And so I selected 30 people, So you have to choose your most trusted friends. Don't invite anyone you're a bit suspicious of. And then we did this gig and we pulled it off, and at the time, I had no real idea at the time that no one had ever done this before, just as I'd no idea in Prague that no one from the West, as a punk or a new wave person or whatever, had come over and done a gig illegally. Yeah, they had like Boney M on the telly and stuff like that. They'd seen Western bands on the telly in Eastern countries, but to actually do something like which was completely under the radar, no one had ever actually done that. And I only realized later on in East Berlin that no one had ever actually done this before. When people kind of in East Germany didn't believe it, it was like, how can this be? How could anyone dare to do this? And this was on both sides of the fence. The East German authorities, like when they found out, they were like, how did this happen? Why did we not know? And also amongst the kids of East Germany, they were like, this is quite revealing, and in the church being this kind of sanctuary in Eastern Europe, they saw that I'd used the church as the kind of like the how do you put it? I mean, it was like a sanctuary, if you like, a sanctuary. And so they all went to their local churches and said, "Can we do a blues mass?" and then they all ended up like, taking over the churches and becoming, the churches became practice places for punk bands. And the priests they didn't really like the music, but they were happy that the kids were there. And for these Germans, it also was they knew where they all were then. So it kind of like they had a bit of a better overview of the punk scene because they had no idea what punk was. It was for the East Germans, it was totally threatening punk. It was like, it was uncontrollable. Like they could control the hippies in the Wrangler jeans listening to Deep Purple and stuff. They could control that. They could control anybody else, the pop kids. But these kind of subversive underground kind of like new wavy types, like, goths and anything that was to do with kind of punk rock, that was for them completely like uncontrollable. So they needed to control it immediately. So they banned it basically. Yeah.
So how important do you think then this type of development in East Germany or in East Berlin was to actually the development of a reaction against the state, because music did play a role in change. How do you see that role that music played?
I think the music was the driving force, the underlying driving force for change in Eastern Europe, undoubtedly. My friends in Czechoslovakia, they were all real dissidents. They were all part of Václav Havel's Charter 77 movement and signatories to that, and also people like Plastic People of the Universe and Marek Kopelent and people like this. They were all very, very active in Václav Havel's movement, and that was the driving force for change. They wanted to be able to buy Pink Floyd, and they wanted to be able to buy Frank Zappa records. They wanted to be able to see these people perform in their country, and that was the kind of like the starting point. They wanted to be able to read George Orwell's 1984 as a proper book and not as a kind of like photocopied version. These are the things which drove the people to want to have change, not just the fact that they wanted to go to Spain on the holidays. It was like, be able to buy frozen peas. It was about culture. It was the cultural thing. Films, music, books, art. These are the things which kind of drove the inertia of what the people in East Germany and Eastern Europe to want to change. And things like John Peel's radio show was listened to religiously in the East on shortwave radio. They'd be like recording the shows. They knew so much because of John Peel, and that was the music was the thing which kind of brought us all together as well. Yeah. What
did you live on at that time?
Oh, God. Well, I worked at the Loft in the 80s, from about 82 till 87 or so. I worked in the Loft, which was a venue here. I was the doorman.
Did you work in the Penguin?
I worked in the Penguin from about 88.
Did I not interview you in the Penguin one night?
Yes, you did. Yeah.
It's just come to me. That's amazing.
You did. Yeah, you did. Yeah. Me and Westbam.
Yes. Yes.
And it was just before. It was literally like about 6 weeks before the wall came down.
That's what I want to get to, and that's why I remember it. It was like I was in West Berlin, and we hooked up with Westbam, and he was showing us around, and he said that we had to meet you, and so we'd gone to this bar, and we'd been filming a program about the wall. And then we went back to London and went into the edit suite. And while I'm in the edit suite, the wall came down. So it was like, we've got to change the end of the program. So we had to fly back. Now, in terms of the wall coming down, I remember going back there when the wall came down. There was this euphoria, of course, the politic euphoria as well. But on the other side, there was also the West Germans looking at the East Germans in their stonewashed jeans and saying, what the hell is going to happen to our city? So there was a sense of fear and foreboding, but in a way that turned very quickly into another sense of excitement and change. Can you explain that period to me?
Yeah, well, before we got to the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I actually missed, right, because I wasn't in Berlin. I left the night before. I've been producing an album in East Berlin for a band called Division, which was like a state record label. Amiga had invited me. Now, this was all to do with my other subversive activities in East Berlin. And the Stasi were curious to what I was doing. So they kind of like invited me to produce this record so they could watch over me, basically. Now, as I'm making this record, East Germany is starting to fall apart. And at the same time, in West Berlin, I was running a bar called the Penguin. Yeah, I was working there, and I was a co-owner of the bar. And so I had to keep, in between doing my shifts in the studio, I'd go and work in the bar as well, a couple of days a week. And I had the best of like both worlds, really. I was going to the East, producing this record during the day, and in the evenings I'd go to the bar and work in the bar. Not every day, but like once a week. And I had no kind of real idea that the wall's going to come down, and there were going to be some changes, but it wasn't like I didn't think, the wall's going to come down. So I had no idea idea, you know, that this was going to happen. And even though people say, yes, well, you could tell that it was going to happen, you couldn't really tell it was going to happen. You knew that there were changes happening because you could see these on the telly, you know, like all these people fleeing, you know, rupturing out of like Eastern Europe into Hungary, you know, and you could see that. But I had this idea, you know, like East Germany will remain, the wall will still be up, but the internal politics will change. And so with some English friends, Dave Rimmer and Trevor Wilson and another guy called John Stokes, we decided we'd go on holiday. When I'd finished producing this album, yeah, we'd go on holiday to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And so the night before the wall came down, I'd finished recording the Division album on the 2nd of November, and on the 7th of November, we decided, you know, right, we can go now. So we left in the night of 8th and 9th of November to go to Poland, and missed the fall of the wall. And as we were in Poland, no one said to us, oh, you've heard the Berlin Wall's come down. We knew nothing until we actually got to Hungary. Like this is days, and like 10 days later or something. It was like long time after the wall had actually come down. I discovered by chance that the wall had come down by looking in an old newspaper. It said, you know, East German troops tear down wall. I was completely flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. And so for this whole kind of like 2 weeks, you know, after the fall of the wall, we had no idea what was going on back home. You know, we had no news even, because we were by this point in Romania, Ceausescu's Romania, and there was no news at all about what was happening in the West, you know. And so we had no idea. And then we came back, you know, after this, we got kicked out of Romania. We came back to West Berlin, and it was like a completely different city. The city that we'd left was no longer there. You know, it was teeming with like East Germans in the, like you said, in the stonewashed jeans and, you know, trainers and stuff that they because, you know, East Germans, when they came to the West, they were given a gift always as 100 German marks. And with this 100 German marks, the first thing that they did was they went off and bought a pair of trainers, a pair of jeans, and a Pink Floyd album. Yeah.
But that's what I was getting at is that period, which I think was really fascinating. The initial part, obviously, you know, you've got these two societies which are a little bit disparate, trying to mix, and that the way that they came together was actually through music and in the dead zone between East and West, wasn't it? So
we had a small techno scene emerging in Berlin since, like, you know, merging out of the acid house scene from the late 80s. We had one club, the UFO club, and that was it, really. You know, these kids in the East had listened to the radio stations of West Berlin. They're listening to Monica Dietl and Barry Graves, and they're thinking, like, this techno scene that's happening in the West sounds amazing. It's great. You know, they can understand the music because it's no difficult to understand lyrics. So it's just music. So they were fascinated by what was happening in West Berlin. And when the wall came down, they all came over here to the West. They discovered there wasn't only one club. So in the deficit of not, you know, like desperation, wanting to have a party and wanting to celebrate, you know, their newfound freedom, they just utilized these derelict, decrepit buildings which were lining the death strip between the two walls, you know, between the west part of the wall and the east part of the wall. There was this kind of no man's land, and in this no man's land there were a couple of buildings and stuff. So they used those as the locations, because no one was going to go in there, and just get a generator, a couple of decks, you know, some smoke machine and a stroboscope, and there you go, you know. And that was what it just like, it doesn't really matter then whether you came from East Berlin or whether you came from, if you were wearing stonewashed jeans, it didn't matter. You know, I never thought that, you know, that these kids from the East, they had no idea what our Western world was like. And to be honest, most of the people in the West didn't know anything what their life was like in the East either. You know, I was really privileged. I knew about what it was like in the East and in the West. So I felt really privileged that I had this insight, and I knew all these places, and I could speak to these East German kids in their own language, really, because East German was different to West, you know. And it was like I knew different things, and I felt really kind of like that I brought these two things together somehow. So I was really thrilled, you know, that finally this moment had happened, you know, that we were victorious, in bringing this freedom, if you like, between the two East Germans and West Germans, these two nations, and they were all dancing on the dance floor together, and it didn't really matter whether you came from Cottbus or whether you came from Cologne. You know, you were like, everybody was the same, and that feeling, that feeling of like unity and energy that was generated was like unparalleled, really. You know, that for the first time, I think people felt free. You know, they felt this feeling of freedom, which we've not had since then at all. You know, it was that moment in time. I think we're very, very lucky. The people who experienced that are very, very lucky to have tasted what freedom really felt like, dancing on ecstasy in a club. You know, like back then, 1990s, early 1990s. You know, it was a very, very special moment. And for you know, the attitudes between, like, you know, what didn't really matter where you came from. That fell away. It was only amongst kind of you like 9-to-5 workers who kind of like looked down upon the East Germans because they were like, just because they were from East Germany. But at the same time, they were fascinated to go to East Germany and explore all these things that they never knew existed before because they'd never had taken the trouble to find out. And it was interesting, the difference in like the way Berlin kind of portrayed the division between East and West, and the way West Germany and East Germany looked at each other as well. You know, it took a long time for that division to kind of like mend itself. Yeah.
No, that's what when I was there, when I saw that, when people were sort of detrimental to East Berliners, to how they looked initially and what it may do to their society. It was odd coming from another society at that point to see that. And interestingly, I think there was also this sort of idealism of who you think you are and who you think other people are. I remember that, well, my best friend comes from Jena, which is in the east, and we obviously met later after the wall came down, and he told me that when he was a teenager, when the wall came down, his parents were given 400 marks, because there were 4 in the family, and they went off to drive to Munich, stop at a petrol station, and his dream as a teenager was to drink Coca-Cola, and he drank one and threw up. And it's, you know, it's sort of symbolic of the dream in your head and the reality. And I think there were visions in the head and realities on both sides, which were false realities. But what was beautiful about this period, and I was often in Berlin at that time, were the expressions of freedom, and also sexual freedom. And as a gay man, in being, you know, visiting Berlin during that period, there was a feeling of total equivalence. Because you were there because of the music. You were there to have fun. You were there to enjoy yourself, and that was the difference. And I think that was a very beautiful thing.
Yeah, and you know, everyone you met, you know, had that same feeling really as well. You know, and I think that all my friends who kind of looked down upon the fact that I went to East Germany and East Berlin, Eastern Europe, whatever, they suddenly realized what they've been missing. Yeah. And I think that was then the thrill that, you know, of this new kind of blood, really, if you like. You know, it was like for both sides. It's for both sides. You know, the West Germans could go to the East and discover the East, and the East Germans could come and discover the West. And then we realized like just how similar we are. You know, they're not aliens. You know, they're just like us, and you find your like-minded kind of people, and like you said, you know, like this liberating feeling that we had was so unique. It was such a. I've always felt that Berlin's always been that open-minded city anyway. It's always been open-minded in comparison to Manchester, where we had one transvestite, you know, Fufu Lamar. Yeah, that was it, really, you know. And in Berlin, it was like I said, the first day I got here, the first person that I met was a transvestite. It was brilliant, you know. It was a real eye opener. I felt so relaxed and so at ease being here. and I've always have done. And I think that was one of the things which kind of like kept me here, you know, not just the music or, you know, the city itself, but like the attitude of this kind of like, everybody seemed to be in the same boat. You know, they'd all been persecuted almost as kids, you know, bullied as kids. And, you know, you're different, you like weird music, you dress like, you know, that this and that. And, you know, what are you wearing those shoes? You know, as a kid, it was a nightmare growing up. You know, I tried to be different. And the minute you step out of normality, you get your head kicked in. You know, I was like, I don't want to live in a society like that. And I come to Berlin, and it was the society that I'd always dreamt of. It, you know, it was this desert island in the middle of East Germany that provided this feeling of like equality that, you know, I wish the rest of the world could experience. Really, we wouldn't be in this fucking stupid situation that we're in now if it was like that. You know.
Yeah, I want to come to that because, I mean, you've had an incredible career, and in a sense, I'm missing a lot of that out, but I want to come to your music at the moment and relate it to the current situation, because I read a post on, I think it was probably on Facebook or Instagram from you the other day, which was also sort of mentioning the situation of, you know, Russia illegally invading Ukraine and what's going on there, and relating it to the 80s, relating it to the Cold War. We're back at this moment of possible nuclear annihilation, and we're back at this horrendous period of history, notwithstanding the poor Ukrainians who are going through hell at the moment. I want to sort of talk about that in terms of how you feel there may be a societal change and a change culturally that may actually step up again.
Well, that's what my post was basically about. You know, like we've had this kind of retro feeling for the past couple of years, you know, like it's like back to the 80s with all these old synthesizers appearing as new, you know, people kind of like wanting to take elements from that period and stuff. And I was thinking, oh, you know, we're entering into the roaring 2020s. So maybe the music scene will change its image, really, because Berlin's been known for the past 30 years as being techno mecca. You know, if everybody comes here, the techno underground scene is massive. So it's not really the underground scene anymore. You know, underground means like 20 people, you know, not 20,000, you know. And when you look at like the way the Love Parade kind of attracted, you know, almost 2 million people in the 90s, you know, it was like in the early 2000s, you know, it was kind of like that was the focus of the musical kind of movement of techno here in Berlin kind of manifested itself. But 30 years later, you know, we've had all techno in various different disguises, kind of like it reinventing itself, but it still remained the same. And I was thinking, there's obviously groups of kids out there playing to their mates who cannot identify with this old 30-year-old kind of music, you know, that they can, obviously, because people consume music differently these days through Spotify, they can listen to all kinds of things, but it's not just one thing anymore. You know, it's not just this one trendy thing anymore. I think techno was the last real kind of trend of the 20th century. And after that, we've just had a regurgitation of the 20th century in some form. And so we're back to the 80s now, right? So we're not only back to the 80s. You can't really feel the 80s if it's just about ABBA on the telly watching them doing Mamma Mia or whatever. It's like, you know, you want to have that 70s anyway, wasn't it? But it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like this kind of idea of like this, what the 80s are supposed to represent. No, the 80s represented also threat and fear of nuclear holocaust, and, you know, the Cold War, East versus West, and all that tension, political tension, which was ratcheted up, especially here in Berlin, was, you know, now we're back to that point too. We've not only gone full circle musically and fashionably, we've also gone full circle politically now. And so, but this time it's a bit more dangerous because there's a lot more players, there's a lot more people in the game, and there's a lot more surveillance and a lot more danger. You know, we've come to George Orwell's 1984 almost in the sense, you know, everything that he kind of wrote in his book has kind of like started to manifest itself in reality here, you know, in the world, which is very frightening. And I've always been fascinated by this book ever since being a child. When I read it the first time, it's you know, it's like I always imagined in 1984 that we'd be like that, but in 1984 we weren't like that, but we are now. You know, all these moving fronts and alliances and loyalties and businesses and things like this, and everything's kind of like, you know, there's fake news and all this kind of stuff. You know, we've come to exactly that point. It's as if we've not really learned anything at all, and the music obviously plays a huge role in that, and the way politics affects us all, whether we want it to do so or not. You know, because I'm not going to read the news, you know, but you read a Facebook post. It affects you somehow, and the developments outside of your control, they affect you, and surely someone making music, that affects them too, you know, and they want to express their inner fears or thoughts through the music, and it doesn't necessarily have to be techno, because let's face it, techno was always an instrumental kind of soundtrack, really. Only in the later years that you started to get like the vocal elements, and that's only because kids could now speak English, because back in 1990 nobody spoke English from the Eastern European countries. Now today English is the internet language, so everybody speaks some kind of English, even if it's just to order something on Amazon. So there's a voice now. People have a voice, and they're able to speak, and they're able to express their opinions and their thoughts in a vocal manner, not just in a musical manner. And so now it's time maybe for younger people to kind of embrace that moment and express themselves musically with in a vocal term as well. And so they take the elements of techno, and they take the elements of rock and dark wave and gothic and whatever, and they put it all together and make something different. And I think that this roaring new sound of the 2020s, after all this business with Ukraine is finished, you know, hopefully soon, you know, we'll see, like in the 1920s after the First World War, we'll see this kind of desire to express oneself, and that's what we're going to have.
I mean, one thing that really fascinated me when you mentioned your new album, not during this conversation we're having here, but in an email, and that how the songs have changed their meaning because of what's happened. Could you tell me about this new album, and tell me about how you now view those songs in the current situation?
The new album I've made together with Lithuanian singer called Alanas Chosnau. And I made this with my studio partner, Misha Adam. And we'd made an album last year, or 2020 it was, called Children of Nature, which touched on kind of more environmental kind of themes. But it also touched on the theme of living in an authoritarian society. You know, because my travels have taken me with B-Movie, for example, my documentary film about Berlin. It's taken me all around the world, like China and all these kind of Belarus and places like this. And so being there and seeing how these kids are growing in their society kind of infiltrated me a little bit, and I wanted to express that in my music. So I'm trying to, in Children of Nature, trying to portray that. So what would happen if they come and get you one day? What are you going to do? You know, and with this new album, I wanted to take it a little step further, because I still felt that we needed to kind of like make this point. Obviously, I don't want it to be kind of blatant and in your face like things are these days. I wanted to be a little bit more subliminal. So as we wrote these songs, wrote them in the context of being like love songs, if you like, you know, between two people, whatever. Or, you know, one of the songs is literally about, you know, the division between Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia being one time partners, and now they're enemies. It was a bit of the George Orwell thing coming through a little bit as well. So it was like now, so but in the context of being two lovers splitting up, you know, or two partners splitting up or whatever, and this feeling of hatred, and why and hatred, not just for yourself and not for your situation, but your hatred for the world, you're angry at everybody, just things like this. And I tried to put all these kind of elements in the songs. In the meantime, we kind of had coronavirus as well, which kind of also was part of the song, like we're just waiting for the end to come, kind of thing. And obviously with this like latest conflict between Ukraine and Russia, that has also put the songs into a totally different kind of context, really. I mean, we'd already planned the album before, and before all this happened, even by end of last year, the idea for the cover was to show, a human being trapped in a global cage of the world, with only one way out. And we have to decide what that one way out is going to be. Is it going to be total annihilation, thermonuclear war, or is it going to be something else? Is it going to be freedom? Is it going to be overthrowing your tyrants and, coming back to reality? And, what do we want in life? We want to have happiness and peacefulness and, fun and laugh. There's time always in our lives to be miserable, but the main goal is to have a nice time, and who are these people like Vladimir Putin to come along, one person, to disrupt that? Like how can we allow that? And how can we allow that in the future to happen? We can't allow that to happen in the future. So now is the time to decide. What kind of future do you want to live in? And that's everybody should make this decision, because it's like they're giving us this last chance almost, and it's a last chance to, if we allow people like Putin to be in power, then we can only expect things like this to happen if we allow that. And I think that all these autocratic leaders of the world, when we were writing this album, it was more about the fear of Donald Trump getting a second time in office. It's like, how would that affect us all? As it happened, he didn't, but we still ended up being in the same situation. And so it's like where do we want to go in the 2020s? Do we want it to be another 10 years war in Europe? Do we want to watch that? Do we want to watch that every day on the news and become immune to the horror and the misery that we're seeing? Do we really want that? I don't, and I'm sure you don't either. And I'm sure that people hearing this podcast, they probably don't want that either. I
mean, music is a common language. It's a common expression, and it's something which connects us all. It's something which has shown throughout your life to have an immense power through what you've achieved in your life, and connected two societies from east to west, which connected later in the late 90s. It connected Manchester to Berlin, and it's connected you to lots of different countries around the world. As you mentioned, B-Movie, which is a fascinating documentary about Berlin, which has taken you all around the world. All I can say at the end is that I love the music on your new album. I love the fact that you've always been in the center of things, and you've always, through your works, and I term it in the wider sense, because not just through music, but through what you've done, you've really pushed for a better world. So Mark Reeder, thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you very much, Steve.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.